The conference room was silent, sterile, and cold, much like the man seated at the head of the glass table. August Merrick didn't believe in wasting words, especially when it came to matters that could be handled with signatures and contracts. He sat with his sleeves rolled, a pen poised between his fingers like a surgeon's scalpel. The city skyline stretched behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Merrick Tower. His tower, where even the sky seemed afraid to say no. Across the table sat Dr. Lauren Fairchild, head of a discreet medical consultancy firm that catered to non-traditional family planning. She had handled contracts like these before, but none with the same intensity or precision August demanded. On the table between them lay a thin folder containing a proposed agreement, sterile in its language but life-altering in its implications. Clean background, no dependents, no substance use, no health flags, Lauren said, tapping a photo clipped inside. And she's agreed to a limited contact clause, no expectations beyond the terms. August didn't glance at the photo. Instead, he tapped the end of the pen once against the table. And why her? She was the most honest one, Lauren replied. No polished story, no manipulative agenda. She said she needed the money to pay for her brother's medical treatment. Period. No tears, no rehearsed sob story. Just quiet desperation. You like people who don't pretend. August's fingers stilled. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd built an empire pretending to care about the people behind his pharmaceuticals. And now here he was, selecting a woman to carry his child as if she were another vendor. He wasn't proud of it, but pride wasn't a luxury he afforded himself anymore. He finally flipped the photo toward him. She wasn't what he expected. No makeup, no attention-seeking pose. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid, the photo slightly overexposed from poor lighting. But her eyes, he noticed those right away, looked straight into the camera. Not challenging, not pleading, just steady. Tula Finch. Age 23, unmarried. No known relatives beyond a younger brother. Confined to a wheelchair since a car accident 2 years prior. She worked as a freelance translator, did part-time shifts at a university library, and had no criminal record. No major relationships. No social media presence worth mentioning. She's a child, he said under his breath. She's a woman who made a choice, Lauren replied, folding her hands. Same as you. The pen made a soft scratch as August signed the agreement. 3 days later, Lula stood in the grand marble lobby of Merrick Tower, clutching a canvas tote bag with a frayed strap. She wore a faded navy dress and an oversized cardigan with loose buttons. Her hair was tied back in the same braid as in her photo, and she looked even younger in person. Small, quiet, self-contained. The assistant who escorted her upstairs didn't speak much. She barely breathed on the elevator ride, her eyes fixed on the soft, glowing floor numbers ticking upward. When the doors opened on the 49th floor, she stepped into an office that felt more like a luxury museum than a workplace. Monochrome furniture, polished glass. Not a fingerprint in sight. August looked up from his desk as she entered. He had expected nerves, maybe awe. But she met his gaze with an awkward little nod. Polite, but not deferential. He didn't stand. "Miss Finch," he said, "you're early." "I thought being late to something like this would be inappropriate," she replied quietly, standing near the door. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. There was a pause, not tense but full of possibilities. She looked around the room like someone memorizing an environment they knew they didn't belong in. She didn't fidget. She didn't try to smile her way into comfort. She just sat, folded hands on her lap. "Do you have any questions before we begin?" he asked. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Why do you want to do this?" August didn't expect that. He stared at her, long and quiet. Most applicants were coached to never ask him anything. They obeyed. They signed. They left. But this girl, this woman, looked at him not as a billionaire, not as a client, but as a man with a strange, private reason for wanting a child without a mother. "I don't want to fall in love again," he said simply, "but I do want a child. The two don't have to coexist." Lula looked down, thoughtful. "You're afraid of repeating something." August's mouth tightened slightly. "You don't get to ask about my past." "I wasn't asking," she said softly. "I was noticing." A silence settled between them. He hated it, and yet part of him respected her more for not trying to fill it. "I've reviewed your medical history," he said, flipping to the page in front of him, "and your results were excellent, all markers optimal. But there was one detail." She nodded before he could say it. "I'm a virgin." There it was. The word dropped between them like a glass marble. He studied her, not out of lust, out of genuine confusion. "Why agree to something like this?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. She folded her hands more tightly. "Because my brother needs spinal surgery that isn't covered by Medicaid. Because I don't want to sell my soul for a GoFundMe campaign. Because if I can give you something you want and save him at the same time, then I'm not losing anything." August stood, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window behind his desk. He watched the city, blinking lights reflected in the glass like distant stars. "You do understand," he said slowly, "that if you change your mind midway through the process, you'll still be bound to the contract. There's no room for second thoughts, no sudden emotions. This isn't a love story." Lula stood as well. "It's not supposed to be." He turned. She was standing there, small but not fragile, resolute. "I don't need romance," she said. "I need results." And for the first time in a very, very long time, August Merrick didn't know if he'd just hired someone, or just met the person who would change everything he thought he knew about love. The waiting room at Verity Medical Institute was quiet, blanketed in the kind of stillness that felt manufactured. Like the air was deliberately sterilized, not just for hygiene, but to mute emotion. The walls were soft cream, the furniture upholstered in gray leather. Minimalist in design, but far from welcoming. Lula Finch sat on the edge of a chair near the corner, her legs crossed at the ankle, fingers curled around a folder of pre-screening documents. She had read them 3 times already. They no longer looked like words, just static on a page. This was the day the process would officially begin. The medical screening had been completed last week, and her legal agreement had been notarized and sealed. But today wasn't about paperwork. It was about preparing her body for implantation, starting hormone therapy, counseling clearance, and final evaluation. It was also the first time she would undergo these steps not as a name on a spreadsheet, but as his chosen candidate. August Merrick hadn't contacted her directly since their conversation in his office, and she didn't expect him to. He wasn't the kind of man who made follow-up calls or checked in emotionally. He made decisions, executed them, moved on. So when the nurse called her name and motioned her into the hallway, Lula stood, adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, and followed without a word. She passed doors with names she couldn't pronounce, saw medical diagrams pinned to walls, and eventually entered a spacious room with an ultrasound machine and several chairs arranged in a triangle. "Mr. Merrick will join us shortly," the nurse said, offering a polite smile as she handed Lula a robe. "Go ahead and change. He's requested to be present during the consultation." Lula paused. "He did?" "Yes, he signed the companion clause. He has full participation rights, including attendance at all major stages of the process." She nodded slowly, processing that. Of course he did. August Merrick never did anything halfway. If he was going to create a child, he'd oversee every molecule of it. She changed behind the privacy curtain, folded her clothes into a neat pile, and sat on the edge of the examination table in the robe, heart thudding faster now. There was something profoundly vulnerable about being this exposed. Not physically, but situationally. She had control over her decision. She'd said yes, but the closer the reality came, the more surreal it felt. A soft knock, then the door opened. August stepped in wearing a tailored dark coat, no tie, sleeves slightly rolled. His presence filled the room instantly. He was one of those men who carried intensity like a second skin. He glanced at her briefly, his gaze unreadable, then nodded toward the physician following him. Dr. Elena Dovek was a lean, meticulous woman in her 50s, with silvering hair in a low twist and a voice smooth as glass. "Miss Finch, Mr. Merrick, will be reviewing your pre-procedural alignment today. Hormone treatments begin immediately after the final compatibility consult." She explained the process in clinical terms: estrogen priming, uterine lining prep, the use of donor sperm unless August had changed his directive. He hadn't. He was the biological father, confirmed through genetic viability analysis. Lula listened, nodding, but her eyes kept flickering to August. He never looked at her directly, only at charts and scans, but there was a tension in his jaw. He stood with his arms crossed, his entire posture alert, almost defensive. When the doctor excused herself to retrieve Lula's file, the room fell into a silence that vibrated. "You didn't have to be here," Lula said quietly, breaking it. "I would have understood." "I'm not here for you," he replied. She nodded slowly, not offended. "Right. You're here for the baby." He looked at her then. Not the quick, cursory glance from before, but directly. His eyes were a pale steel blue, and when they locked with hers, she felt like she'd walked into a wind tunnel. "I'm here because I need to know everything is real," he said. "That it's not just names on paper. That this," he gestured to the space between them, "is more than a transaction. Not emotionally, logistically." She held his gaze. "It feels real to me." That silenced him for a moment. He turned away, moved to the corner where her chart had been left, and picked it up. "You've never been pregnant." She blinked. "Correct." "Never in a relationship. No sexual history. No prior contraception." He read the words like a lawyer, as if they were abstract concepts, not parts of her life. "You already knew that." "I did, but now I've heard it in the doctor's handwriting." There was something about how he said it, like it wasn't a confirmation of statistics, but a realization of consequence. She tilted her head. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said after a beat. "It surprises me, and I don't like surprises." Lula smiled faintly. "Then you really shouldn't have picked me." He looked at her again, and this time his gaze lingered. Not in a predatory way, but with a quiet, unsettled curiosity. Like she was a puzzle whose corners he couldn't fit. Before he could respond, Dr. Dovek returned with a digital tablet. "We're good to begin," she said. "Lula, I'll start the scan now." Lula lay back as the doctor prepared the machine. Cold gel hit her skin, and she flinched. August stayed in the corner, stiff, silent, but his eyes tracked every movement. When the doctor displayed the monitor, he stepped closer, just slightly, and watched the image emerge. There was nothing there yet. Just the outline of her uterus, the curves of her anatomy, the dark spaces where life might soon exist. "You'll start hormones tomorrow," Dr. Dovek said. "We anticipate readiness for embryo transfer in 3 weeks. After that, we monitor closely for implantation. No strenuous activity, no travel. And, Mr. Merrick, if you wish to continue as a presence, we'll schedule joint updates." He gave a short nod. "Of course." When the appointment was over, Lula changed back into her clothes and stepped outside. August was already waiting near the elevator, his coat over one arm, a look on his face she couldn't quite name. She stopped beside him. They stood in silence until the elevator dinged. Just before the doors opened, he said quietly, "You were braver than I expected in there." She looked at him. "So were you." They stepped into the elevator side by side, neither one speaking, but something had changed. Not the contract, not the plan, just the air. And maybe, just maybe, the distance between two people who weren't supposed to care. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of August Merrick's penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Outside, the city stretched in soft gray layers, still waking, still unaware of the slow, quiet shift that had begun inside its most unapproachable man. August stood barefoot in the kitchen, a rare sight even to himself, stirring honey into a mug of dark black tea, as if the act of sweetness required deliberate thought. He hadn't planned on seeing Lula again until the next scheduled appointment, but her presence at the clinic had lingered. Something about the way she'd sat in that exam room, calm, open, unflinching, unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't afraid. She was just present. Most people, when faced with his attention, performed. But not Lula Finch. His phone buzzed against the counter, vibrating with a notification from his assistant. A brief message. "Lula Finch. Arrived. Guest house prepared. Security cleared. Per your instructions. Private driver, no media." He glanced at the clock. She was early again. He shouldn't have cared. He told himself it was all part of the arrangement. The clause that stated she would live in the guest house on his private estate for the duration of her pregnancy, to ensure maximum oversight and convenience for medical monitoring. It was a common clause in these kinds of contracts, and she had agreed without flinching. But the idea of her living just across the manicured garden, visible from his study, from his bedroom, suddenly felt intrusive. Or maybe it was the idea that he might become intrusive. And he didn't know what to do with that. Lula sat quietly in the back of the car as it pulled through the private gates. She had never seen anything like the Merrick estate. 7 acres of sculpted landscape tucked on the edge of the city, secluded but not remote. The mansion was all glass and stone, rising from the earth like a modern temple. To the east, a smaller structure hugged the trees. Her new home, the guest house, a minimalist dream with its own garden path and shaded veranda. She stepped out of the car, tugging her coat tighter. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, with hints of something floral she couldn't name. A staff member greeted her politely and handed her a sleek folder of information. Schedules, doctor appointments, a key card, and an emergency contact list. August's name was at the top. Her room was warm, sunlit, and impossibly quiet. The linens were soft, untouched. A basket of essentials sat on the table. Prenatal vitamins, ginger tea, a custom-wrapped journal with her initials embossed in gold foil, and a note. In crisp, unfamiliar handwriting, "For your comfort. If anything is missing, let the staff know. A.M." She read it 3 times before tucking it between the pages of the journal. Later that afternoon, she found herself wandering the edge of the garden path that connected the main house to the guest wing. The wind pulled at the hem of her sweater, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she stepped beneath the arched pergola, covered in late-blooming wisteria. That's when she saw him. August stood on the back patio of the main house, sleeves rolled, phone forgotten in one hand as he stared at the garden. He hadn't seen her yet. His expression was blank, thoughtful, almost haunted. She wondered what occupied the mind of a man who had everything and seemed to enjoy none of it. She took a careful step closer. The gravel shifted beneath her feet. His head turned sharply. Their eyes met. He blinked once, then set his phone down on the stone table and walked toward her, slow but direct. "You're settling in," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she replied. "It's more than I expected." A pause. The wind passed between them. She could hear the soft crunch of leaves above, the chirp of a lone bird somewhere deeper in the trees. He gestured toward the bench at the edge of the garden. "May I?" She nodded, and they sat. 2 silhouettes beneath a lattice of shadows and sun, like opposing chess pieces pausing mid-game. "I've lived here 7 years," he said after a while, "but I've never sat here." She glanced sideways at him. "Why now?" "I don't know." He looked at her then. "Maybe because you're here." Her breath caught, just for a second, but she said nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers slightly curled. She didn't know what response he expected. Gratitude? Humor? A deflection? So, instead, she told the truth. "When I agreed to this, I thought I would feel invisible," she said. "Like a machine with a timeline. But being here, near you, it's strange. You don't act like I'm irrelevant, but you don't act like I'm real either." His gaze sharpened, but not in anger. "I don't know how to act around you," he admitted. That startled her more than anything. Honesty from him felt like lightning. "I'm used to people wanting things from me," he continued. "Control, power, influence. You're the first person who doesn't want anything beyond what we already agreed on. That makes you unpredictable." "I'm not trying to be unpredictable," she said softly. "I'm just trying to be enough." Her voice cracked on that word, enough, and it cut through the silence like glass breaking. August leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, fingers laced. "You already are." Lula froze. He stood quickly, as if realizing he'd gone too far. He brushed imaginary dust from his shirt. "I should let you rest. Dinner will be brought to your room at 6. She watched him walk away without another word, the back of his figure rigid, composed. But something had shifted. Not in the contract, not in the rules. In him. And maybe a little in her, too. It wasn't a gentle drizzle, but a full, pounding storm, the kind that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the earth, drumming on the rooftops, shaking windows in their frames. Thunder cracked the sky open like a warning, and lightning forked through the clouds in jagged flashes that lit up the gardens surrounding the Merrick estate like strobe lights. Lula sat upright in bed, startled awake. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, still flat, but more symbolic than anything. The hormones were coursing through her body now, preparing it for the next step, and her sleep had grown fragile, restless, laced with strange dreams and moments of unease. She got up and padded across the hardwood floor to the window. From her guest house, she could see the silhouette of the main house, its towering glass walls shimmering each time the sky lit up. Most of the lights were off. It looked, as always, like a fortress more than a home. Except one room. One window was glowing softly, somewhere on the upper floor. She didn't know why she noticed it, or why it mattered. But it did. Lightning cracked again. The boom of thunder rattled through the night, and Lula winced. After a few more minutes of staring into the dark, she left her bedroom, pulled a knit shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the covered walkway that connected her guest wing to the main house. The wind rushed through the trees, cold and sharp, but the path was lit with subtle garden lamps that led the way like breadcrumbs. She didn't stop to question herself. She didn't think about protocol or boundaries. She only knew one thing. She didn't want to be alone. She reached the side door to the main house and hesitated, then raised her hand and knocked, softly at first. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Then the door opened. August stood there, barefoot, in gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt. His hair was slightly tousled, and his eyes, so often emotionless, were weary, shadowed, but alert. He didn't look angry to see her. He looked surprised. Human. The storm, she said simply, her voice low. I couldn't sleep. He didn't move for a moment, and then he stepped back without a word, holding the door open wider. She entered quietly, water dripping from the hem of her robe. Come upstairs, he said after a beat. I was awake anyway. She followed him through the dimly lit hallway and up a staircase made of glass and polished steel. It felt surreal, being inside the private part of his world, the one no one saw, not even his employees. His home didn't look staged like she had imagined. It was cold in design, but lived in small, unexpected ways. A half-empty cup of tea sat on a table beside a leather armchair. A stack of music records, jazz and blues mostly, rested against the wall near a sleek sound system. A sketchbook lay open on the kitchen island, filled with dark charcoal lines and abstract smudges that looked almost violent. He led her into a wide, high-ceilinged room, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rain-slick garden. A fire was burning low in the hearth. August crossed the room and threw another log onto the flames, watching them rise before turning back to her. You okay? He asked. Lula nodded, then shook her head. I don't know. He gestured to the couch near the fireplace. Sit. She did, curling her legs beneath her, pulling the robe tighter. He remained standing, his arms crossed, as if he wasn't sure whether to engage or withdraw. The hormones, she began, they're intense. I feel things I don't understand. I feel like I'm someone else half the time. But tonight, it wasn't that. It was just loneliness. It came out of nowhere. He looked at her for a long time. I know that kind, he said finally. It doesn't knock first. It just enters and stays. Lula stared at the fire, its shadows dancing across the walls. Is that what this house is built for? To keep it out? He didn't answer right away. Then he sat down beside her. Not too close, but close enough to feel the warmth of his body. This house was built to protect what I thought I needed, he said. Distance, structure, silence. She glanced at him. And now? I'm starting to wonder if silence is just another word for hiding. They sat like that for a while. No roles, no business arrangement, just two people bruised by the weight of their own decisions. The storm raged outside, a symphony of thunder and wind and rain that felt almost like background music to something neither of them could name yet. August leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. I lost someone, he said quietly. Years ago. We were married. She was kind and smart and wanted a family more than anything. But something was always broken between us. We kept trying. We tried IVF, surrogacy. Nothing worked. Eventually, it broke us too. Lula didn't speak. She let him unravel the thread in his own time. She died in a car accident. I wasn't with her. I was working. I always thought there would be more time. A pause. Then he turned to her, the firelight catching the tension in his jaw. I told myself I didn't want another relationship. Just a child. Something of me. After me. But now I see you here, and I'm beginning to think I didn't want just a child. I wanted something to hold on to, something that wouldn't leave. Her throat tightened. You don't have to be alone, August. I don't know how not to be, he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. He didn't flinch. The storm rolled on outside, but inside the room it softened. The air shifted. The distance between them shrank. Not through grand gestures, but through presence, through vulnerability, through something raw and real that had nothing to do with contracts or biology. August looked down at their joined hands. I didn't expect you, he said. Not like this. I didn't expect any of this, Lula replied, but maybe that's the point. He looked at her then, really looked, eyes searching, not in dominance, but in awe, like he was seeing her for the first time and realizing he hadn't looked closely enough before. You should rest, he murmured. She nodded, stood slowly but hesitated. Thank you for letting me in. You're always allowed in, he said. I just didn't know how to open the door before tonight. She left, heart pounding, steps light. As she walked the garden path back to her guest house, the rain eased. The storm was ending. But inside her, something else had just begun. The days that followed the storm were quiet, but not in the way they had been before. Something had shifted between Lula and August. Their arrangement, still bound by legality and logic, had begun to breathe with something warmer, more unpredictable. It was in the way he lingered during doctor's visits now, his gaze softening when he watched her answer questions. It was in how she no longer waited for his permission to speak. Their silences were no longer voids to be filled, but moments of understanding. One particularly warm morning in early spring, Lula was in the kitchen of the guest house, stirring honey into a cup of tea, when she heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. She looked up from the counter, and through the window she saw August approaching. Not in a suit, not in his usual stoic armor, but in jeans and a charcoal Henley with the sleeves pushed up. He looked younger like this, less untouchable. She opened the door before he could knock. "You're up early," she said, surprised. "I could say the same about you." His voice was quiet, almost playful. "Am I interrupting?" She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "You're the one who owns the place. Technically, I should be asking if I'm interrupting." He walked into the kitchen, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. "I've never been in here." It's surprisingly cozy for something designed by a man who builds entire lives out of steel and glass. He smiled faintly and leaned against the counter. "You decorated." "I moved a pillow and bought a plant." His eyes flicked toward the small fern in the window. "It's still alive?" She laughed softly. "For now." He nodded at her tea. "Are you feeling okay? The nurse said the hormone shifts could get worse before they settle." Lula hesitated. "They're intense, yeah. I cry at cereal commercials and got irrationally angry at my own sweater yesterday. But I'm okay." August studied her for a beat. "I'd like to take you somewhere." Her eyebrows lifted. "Somewhere?" "Just for the afternoon, off the property." Lula blinked. "Are you asking me on a date?" "No," he said too quickly, then reconsidered. "Yes, but not in the traditional sense. No romantic pressure, no expectations. Just two people outside of this arrangement for a few hours." She was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I want to know who you are," he said. "Not just as the woman carrying my child. Not just as the girl who made a deal. I want to know you." Lula searched his face, looking for the agenda she'd always assumed was there. But for once, she saw nothing hidden. Just sincerity, and something that looked like longing. She nodded. "Okay. Where are we going?" "You'll see." They drove in silence at first. Not uncomfortable silence, just one of shared anticipation. August drove himself, which surprised her. He didn't bring staff or a security detail, and his hands were steady on the wheel, familiar with the road. He drove them west, away from the city, into rolling hills and wooded back roads that curled around old stone fences and wildflowers. After nearly an hour, they pulled into the gravel driveway of a quiet lakeside park. There was no one around. A few canoes bobbed lazily on the shore, and the trees whispered in the breeze. Lula stepped out of the car and breathed in deeply. The air was clean, cool, tinged with the scent of damp moss and spring. "You come here often?" she asked. "Not in years," August replied. "My father used to bring me here when I was a kid. We'd fish, skip stones, just be quiet together." He led her to a small wooden dock that jutted out into the lake. They sat at the edge, feet dangling just above the water. Lula kicked off her shoes and dipped her toes in. August stayed still. "You don't take your shoes off?" she teased. "I haven't in a long time." She leaned back on her palms, soaking in the sun. "That's a metaphor, isn't it?" He looked at her, lips twitching. "You're not wrong." They sat in silence, listening to the wind. After a while, he spoke. "When I lost my wife, I shut everything down, emotionally. I told myself I was just reorganizing priorities, but really, I just couldn't handle the mess of feeling. I built order. I built rules. This whole thing with you, it was supposed to be part of that system." "I know," Lula said softly. "I could feel it." "But the moment I met you, it didn't feel like a transaction," he admitted. "I told myself it was still control, still calculated. But you kept showing up with this quiet honesty. It undid everything. Lula's eyes shimmered in the sun, but she didn't cry. Not now. Do you regret it? She asked. Choosing me? He turned to her, slow and deliberate. No, he said. You were the first choice I made for the right reason. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The air between them held something sacred. After a while, she leaned her head on his shoulder. He let her. When the breeze picked up, he reached into his jacket and handed her a folded paper. She unfolded it slowly. It was a sketch, charcoal on rough paper. A figure standing at the edge of a lake, the outline of a woman, one hand on her belly, the other shading her eyes as she looked at the horizon. Lula stared at it for a long moment. It's me, she whispered. Yes, August said. It's what I see when I look at you. She held the drawing like it was made of glass. I didn't think you looked at me at all, she said. I do, he replied. More than I should. The sun began to dip lower behind the trees. Shadows grew longer, but they didn't move. They stayed there at the edge of the lake, caught in a moment they didn't plan for, didn't predict, and no longer wanted to escape. Something had changed again, and this time there would be no going back. The following week passed in a strange kind of stillness, not the cold, sterile stillness August Merrick was used to, the kind that followed deliberate decisions and signed agreements, but something warmer, heavier, like the air before a summer storm. It hummed beneath everything, every shared glance, every footstep on the polished floors of the estate, every accidental brush of skin when their hands passed too close at the breakfast table. Lula had begun spending more time outside, walking the gardens slowly in the early mornings when the world still felt untouched. Her body had started to respond to the hormone regimen. She felt heavier in places, sleepier, more aware of every change. The fertility specialists called this a priming stage, but Lula knew better. She was preparing for more than just motherhood. August had become quieter too, but not withdrawn, more observant. He asked small, intimate questions now about her childhood, her favorite books, if she liked thunderstorms, if she'd ever been in love. She never answered that last one, because she wasn't sure if she was in love now, and that terrified her. One evening, just before dusk, Lula returned from her walk to find a plain white envelope resting on the small table in the foyer of the guest house. Her name was written on it in a precise, bold hand she recognized instantly. She opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper. It wasn't typed, it was handwritten. Lula, there are parts of this arrangement I regret, not because I doubt you, but because I was dishonest with myself about what I wanted from the beginning. I thought I could control this, keep it clean, professional, contained. But you've become more than a decision I made. You've become real, necessary. I've asked my lawyers to nullify the non-emotional clause in the contract, effective immediately. You're not bound to remain silent about what you feel, or to hide from what I might. Come to the main house, tonight. I'd like to talk to you without paperwork between us. Alula read it 3 times, her fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the quiet knowledge that everything was about to shift again. This time, by choice. She didn't hesitate. When she arrived at the main house, the front doors were already open. The interior lights were dimmed, the warmth of the space drawing her in like the pulse of something alive. She followed the faint sound of music, jazz, low and rich, until she reached the back room, the one with the fireplace, the leather chairs, and the giant windows that framed the dusk. August stood near the fire, dressed simply as he had been at the lake. No suit, no layers of armor. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression, softness mixed with absolute gravity, made her breath catch. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he gestured to the seat near him. She sat. "I didn't ask you here to confuse you," he began. "I asked because I can't continue lying to myself, or to you." She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the letter still clutched between her fingers. "From the beginning," he continued, "I set boundaries so I wouldn't feel anything. I wanted a child, not a connection, not a complication, but I underestimated you." She tilted her head, her voice gentle. "What did you expect me to be?" He hesitated. Quiet, obedient, forgettable. She smiled faintly. "And instead?" He stepped closer. "Instead, you looked me in the eye and never asked for less than you deserved, even when you were getting less." Her throat tightened. "I've spent years building walls around my life, around my grief, around my past. But you walked in and never asked for access. You just stayed. And every time I tried to ignore what I felt, you made it harder." His voice faltered, just slightly. "I know what I said before, about this not being a love story, but I think I was wrong." Lula stood then, slowly. Her hands dropped to her sides. She looked up at him, and for once, he didn't tower over her. He seemed vulnerable, leveled by his own honesty. "What are you saying, August?" she asked quietly. "I'm saying I want this to be more," he said. "I want the contract gone. I want choice instead of obligation. I want the child. But more than that, I want you." The silence that followed was a breath held between worlds. And then she crossed the distance between them. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, just stood still as she laid a hand against his chest. "I said yes to carrying your child," she whispered, "but I never thought I'd fall in love with the man behind the offer." His eyes closed briefly. "And I never thought I'd deserve the woman who said yes." Her other hand came up to his face, cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing against the line of his cheek. "I don't want a contract either," she said. "I want the truth, whatever that means. However complicated it gets." He leaned into her palm, eyes opening, gaze heavy with emotion. "Then let me give you the truth." And he kissed her. Not like a businessman, not like a man fulfilling a clause, but like someone starving for touch, for meaning, for forgiveness. The kiss was slow, tender, then deeper. Years of longing pressed into the space between two people who had been afraid of what they needed most. She melted into him, and he held her with care, as if he were still learning how. They didn't go upstairs, not that night. Instead, they sat together on the couch, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest, listening to the storm of their past lives fade into the hum of something new, something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for both of them, that was the first miracle. The morning after their kiss, the world didn't transform into a fairy tale. The sun didn't shine brighter, nor did the birds sing sweeter. In fact, the sky was heavy with low clouds, the air thick with the scent of oncoming rain. But for Lula, everything felt different. She awoke in her guest house with a lingering warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the thick quilt wrapped around her. It was something deeper, like the thrum of a song she hadn't realized she'd been humming all along. She touched her lips absent-mindedly, replaying the night before. The confession, the closeness, the quiet moments pressed against August's chest while the fireplace glowed. It hadn't been dramatic, hadn't been explosive, but it had been real, and that realness lived beneath her skin now, humming through her blood. She half expected that when she stepped outside, something would have changed, that the staff would look at her differently, that the garden path between the two houses would feel somehow foreign. But everything appeared as usual. The pines whispered softly in the breeze, the fountain gurgled steadily, and no one interrupted her as she made her way toward the main house. What had changed was waiting for her behind the front door. August stood barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, a faint smudge of flour on the side of his hand. There was a skillet sizzling on the stove, a cracked egg resting in a ceramic bowl nearby, and 2 plates already set out. "I thought you didn't cook," she said from the doorway. "I don't," he replied, not turning around. "But I figured I could learn one thing before the baby comes." Lula smiled and walked into the kitchen. She watched as he cracked another egg, far too carefully, as if it might explode in his hand. "I feel like I'm watching a tiger try to knit," she teased. "Unnecessary commentary from the peanut gallery," he murmured, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. They sat down to a slightly overcooked breakfast, but Lula didn't care. The food didn't matter. The effort did. He was trying. This man, who had once used contracts to shield himself from even the smallest human touch, was now burning toast in her honor. After they cleared the plates, they went for a walk through the grove behind the estate. It was a narrow trail Lula hadn't yet explored, shaded by arching branches and thick green underbrush. The air was earthy, rich with the smell of pine needles and moss, and the crunch of their footsteps echoed between the trees. August walked beside her in silence for a while before speaking. "I never thought I'd be here," he said. "I thought I'd hand over a set of keys, a bank account, a few signatures, and in 9 months walk away with a child. No mess, no involvement. And now?" she asked gently, not looking at him. He exhaled. "Now I can't imagine walking away from anything that involves you." Lula stopped walking. She looked at him. Not dramatically, not seeking validation, but because she needed to see him when she said it. "I didn't plan on falling in love with you, August. I didn't even think you were capable of letting someone in. But here we are." He stepped closer, slowly, as if giving her room to back away if she needed to. She didn't. "I want this to be more than a story that surprises us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want it to be a story we write, deliberately, together." He cupped her face with both hands. "Then let me begin." He kissed her again, more confidently this time, but still with that reverent caution, as though some part of him still didn't quite believe she was real. The forest seemed to go still around them, trees leaning in to listen as their mouths moved in quiet promise. When they returned to the house, Lula curled up with a book in the study, while August made calls from his office. She could hear the low hum of his voice through the half-closed door, the occasional edge of tension as he navigated business like a man who had only half of his heart in the room. She smiled to herself. Later, he joined her on the couch, files forgotten, tie loose around his neck. He didn't speak, just reached for her hand and threaded their fingers together. They sat like that as the sky outside darkened, and eventually she rested her head on his shoulder, letting her eyes slip closed. But before she could drift off completely, He whispered something against her hair. "I'm scared," he said. She didn't move. Of what? Of getting this wrong, of hurting you, of being someone who doesn't deserve any of this. "You already are someone who deserves it," she replied. "You're just not used to being forgiven for your past." He didn't respond, but his fingers tightened around hers. That night, they didn't sleep apart. Lula woke in his bed, wrapped in his arms, his breathing soft and steady against the back of her neck. No sex, no urgency, just presence. Just two people who had stopped pretending that what was happening between them was temporary. In the quiet dark, she whispered a word she hadn't allowed herself to speak until now. Love. She didn't need to say it to him. Not yet, but she knew. And in the rise and fall of his breath, in the way he reached for her even in sleep, she knew he was already saying it back. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the warm glow of a single wall sconce and the soft blue monitor lights that pulsed in, rhythm with Lula's heartbeat. Rain tapped steadily against the large window pane, a gentle sound that contrasted the sharp, focused energy inside the room. August sat at her side, fingers clasped tightly around hers, eyes locked on her face as the contractions came again, harder this time, and her whole body tensed with pain. She didn't scream. She was too strong for that, but the moan that escaped her lips was raw and guttural. He hated the sound, not because it was loud, but because it meant she was hurting, and there was nothing he could do except be there. He had always been a man who solved things, fixed things, controlled outcomes, but this was one thing he could not command. Lula's eyes fluttered open in the small pause between contractions. Her face was slick with sweat. Her hair stuck to her forehead in damp waves. Still, she looked at him with fierce clarity. "Don't let go," she whispered. "I won't," he said, tightening his grip. "I'm right here." The nurse checked the monitors again, gave them an encouraging nod, and quietly stepped back to allow the doctor to come in. The room was calm, but beneath the surface was a trembling tension, a quiet anticipation that came with knowing they were standing at the threshold of something irreversible. The past 9 months had not been smooth. There were moments of fear, moments when Lula bled more than she should have, when test results were unclear, when August had to fly home from meetings with his heart pounding and hands shaking. But they had made it through. Together. And now, here they were, on the edge of becoming something new. Another contraction hit, and Lula cried out this time, body curling in on itself, and August leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "Breathe," he whispered, not just to her, but to himself. "You've got this. You're the strongest person I've ever met." "I hate you," she gasped through clenched teeth. "I swear I hate you for getting me into this." He smiled, though his eyes stung with emotion. "Good. Hate keeps you pushing." "I'm serious." "I know, but you can yell at me all you want after you meet her." Lula blinked through the pain. "Her?" He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a small folded card. "I wrote something," he said softly, "in case I panicked and forgot how to talk when the baby came. Want to hear it?" She nodded, though another contraction started to build. He opened the card with trembling fingers and began to read, his voice low and careful. "Dear Lula, you said yes to something that should have been impossible. You made room in your body and in your life for a child that wasn't even yours yet. But now she's ours. Not because we signed papers, not because we arranged it, but because we grew into something we never planned. You and me, a family. Lula's throat closed up as the contraction peaked, tears sliding down her cheeks. But they weren't just from the pain anymore. "I love you," August said, setting the card aside and taking her face gently in his hands. "Whatever happens, I love you. You didn't save me. You changed me. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget that." The doctor stepped closer then, voice calm but urgent. "It's time." Everything after that happened in a blur. The sterile movements of gloved hands, the lights brightening, the quiet orders from nurses. August never left her side. He held her hand as she pushed, counted with her, breathed with her, and when the final cry tore out of Lula's throat, followed by the sharp, sudden wail of a newborn, August felt something in him shatter and rebuild all at once. The nurse held up the baby girl for just a second before placing her on Lula's chest. The child was small, flushed, covered in warmth and newness and life. Lula looked down at her, eyes wide and wet, a sob catching in her throat. "She's real," she whispered. "She's perfect," August said, unable to stop the tears that blurred his vision. He bent down and kissed Lula's temple, then the tiny forehead of the baby nestled against her. The nurses moved efficiently, wrapping the baby in a soft blanket, checking vitals, whispering reassurances. Lula didn't let go of her daughter once. August didn't let go of Lula. Hours passed. The rain slowed. The world outside grew quiet again. Later, alone in the recovery room, Lula lay in bed holding the baby girl against her chest. August sat beside them, his arm around both of them, unable to stop watching the rise and fall of the baby's tiny breaths. "Have you decided on a name?" the nurse asked softly when she came to check on them. Lula looked at August. He nodded. "Her name is Marin," Lula said. "Marin Elise Merrick." The nurse smiled and wrote it down. August leaned in and whispered, "She looks like you." "No," Lula murmured, looking at him. "She looks like us." They stayed in the hospital for 2 days, a bubble of warmth and wonder. No phones, no press, no board meetings, no staff. Just the 3 of them. Lula, August, and the miracle child that had brought 2 strangers from opposite ends of heartbreak into the center of something neither could have imagined. When they returned home, the estate didn't feel cold anymore. The glass windows reflected sunlight instead of shadows. The halls echoed with Marin's coos and cries. The guest house became a nursery, and the master bedroom had 2 parents now. August still went to work, but he came home earlier. He kissed Lula on the forehead every morning and held his daughter every night. One afternoon, as they stood in the backyard watching the sun set behind the trees, August took Lula's hand and turned to her with that same look he had worn when he first broke the rules of their contract. "I don't care how we started," he said, "only that we never end." Lula smiled, eyes glinting with tears and joy. "We won't," she said. "We already rewrote the ending." And in that moment, surrounded by the garden that had once only been a path between 2 houses, they stood together as a family, unwritten, unfinished, but finally whole.